Hello, Mr. Hardy here, and in this video I would like to teach you about the poem Partition by Sujata Bhatt. So we'll start by reading Partition by Bhatt. We'll then go through it to check we understand what is happening in the poem. I'll then identify the poem's key message and any areas of conflict you may wish to explore in an answer. We'll then read through the poem again, identifying the key language, structure and poetic techniques that Bhatt has employed. And then I'll leave you with an exam-style question at the end that you can have a go at answering if you wish to get some practice in. So, our poet, Sujata Bhatt. Bhatt was born in 1956 and is still alive today at the making of this video, which is in 2023. So she is a contemporary poet and she deals with the issues our society is currently facing in our modern era. Bhatt is an Indian poet and she was born in Ahmedabad. I include that because there's reference to this city in the poem. And this poem could be classed under a category of literature called post-colonial literature. Specifically, this would be a post-colonial poem. Before World War II, Britain had an empire. It was called the British Empire, and this was where we went around conquering other countries to form our empire. And one of the countries that was conquered was India, and it was often referred to as the jewel in the crown of the empire. It was probably the most important country that the British Empire colonised and occupied. Now, post-colonial means it's after the occupation. So after World War II, Britain gave India back its independence. It withdrew from India, and it was supposed to be quite a positive thing. India gets back control over its own country. It can be independent again. However, it wasn't a smooth process. It was a really messy process. And during this process, India split into India and Pakistan. And this divide, which happened for many reasons, sort of cultural reasons, religious reasons, political reasons, resulted in around about 1 million people dying, and anywhere between 14 to 18 million people being displaced, so losing their home, either having to flee from India to Pakistan or vice versa from Pakistan across the border to India. So this partition of India happened in 1947, which for those of you who know your history will know happened just after World War II. So this is what the poem centres around, the partition of India, and the poet Bhatt has shortened it to the title Partition. Partition means to divide, to separate into parts. So let's read Partition by Bhatt. She was 19 years old then, and when she stood in her garden, she could hear the cries of the people stranded in the Ahmedabad railway station. She felt it was endless, their noise, a new sound added to the city. Her aunt, her father's sister, would go to the station every day with food and water. But she felt afraid, felt she could not go with her aunt, so she stood in the garden, listening. Even the birds sounded different, and the shadows cast by the neem trees brought no consolation. And each day she wished she had the courage to go with her aunt, and each day passed with her listening to the cries of the people. Now when my mother tells me this at midnight in her kitchen, she's 70 years old and India is 50. But of course India is older than that, she says. India was always there. But how I wished I had gone with my aunt to the railway station. I still feel guilty about that. And then she asks me, how could they have let a man who knew nothing about geography divide a country? So there you have it, Partition by Bhatt. It's one long stanza. That's the arrangement of this poem. So we're going to go through it in chunks and sections. Now I don't want you to refer to it as stanza 1, 2, 3 and 4 because that's not accurate. It is one long stanza, but to make it manageable and make it look presentable on the screen, I've just divided it into 4 sections. So in this first section we are introduced to a third person narration. We know it's third person because of the pronoun she, and this narration is in the past tense. We know that because of the past tense verb was. So this poem centres around the personas mother. So the persona is what we would call the character in the poem. Now, I personally believe that the persona or the voice of this poem is Sujata Bhatt herself. And this poem centres on the persona's mother. So I believe this poem is all about Bhatt's mother. I believe there's some truth to the narration, the story of this poem. And in this poem, Bhatt's mother was in Ahmedabad during the partition, and that would have been a city near where India and Pakistan was divided, where the border was created. Now, Bhatt's mother's auntie was quite active in helping people during the partition. She brought food and water to the station every day. She sacrificed some of her own resources. She put herself in danger to help people. However, Bhatt's mother stayed behind in the garden in a place of relative safety, sort of passively listening to the effects of the partition, but not getting involved in helping. In this second section, this idea of the aunt being quite brave and helping, and Bhatt's mother being quite scared and passive is developed. So Bhatt's mother is afraid, and she didn't do much. She stood around in the garden. We know this because the words such as stood and listening get repeated a lot, which is very passive. But from the garden, she's able to observe the effects of the partition of India, and it's a lot of agony, really. We hear cries of people being repeated a couple of times. We get a soundscape. That's when the poet tries to use oral imagery, sound images, to explain the effect of the partition on the Indian and Pakistani people. However, she observes that her auntie is going out to help people, and she wishes she had the courage to go and do the same. So in this third section, which happens at line 20, there is a Volta. Volta is a poetic term. It's when there's a change in tone in the poem. So from lines 1 to 19, it was all in the past tense. It was all dealing with Bhatt's mother when she was 19 years old. But from line 20 onwards, we've flashed forward. We've moved forward in time, 51 years later, to the present. We know that because Bhatt's mother is 70 years old. We also know it's the present tense because was has been changed into is, which is the present tense version of the verb. And the setting of this section of the poem is in a kitchen, and Bhatt, or the persona, which I believe is Bhatt, is talking to her mother, and the mother is recounting her thoughts and feelings about experiencing the partition of India. And the mother shares this using dialogue, using speech, and explains what she thinks and feels about the partition of India. And what we learn in this final section, which looks really unusual on the page, there's loads of indents and punctuation marks, we learn through this that Bhatt's mother regrets being passive at the time, and she feels guilty. She feels maybe she could have helped more people instead of staying in the garden. She could have been a bit more like her auntie. She also very angrily questions how such a thing, such as a partition, could have been allowed to happen. It was such a destructive, damaging event. 1 million people dead, anywhere from 14 to 18 million people made homeless, forced to flee and become migrants and refugees. How could a modern human society allow that to happen? So that's what's going on in the poem from a narrative point of view. And I do want to point out that I think this poem is a narrative poem. So there's elements of a story in this poem. There are settings, such as the garden, the railway station, the kitchen. There are characters, such as Bhatt's mother and the auntie. And there's also a plot. We go through time from when she was 19 years old to when she was 70 years old, using a flash forward. So we have some kind of plot. So I think this poem 100% qualifies as a narrative poem. So what is this narrative post-colonial poem's message? Well, Partition by Bhatt is a post-colonial poem, and it recounts the physical effects of the partition of India, particularly the suffering of the people. We hear that with cries of the people being repeated, and that soundscape, that oral imagery. We then learn about the emotional effects of the partition afterwards, even though 50 years or 51 years has elapsed since Bhart's mother experienced the partition of India. She still feels the guilt and the regret from it. It's had a massive psychological effect on her. So we learn that conflict has physical effects and emotional effects. And those are our two main areas of conflicts that we could write about in an exam. Initially, there would have been physical conflict between the British Empire and India. When Britain arrived on the shores of India to conquer it, there would have been conflict involved. There was also conflict between India and Pakistan. So when the partition came in for political, for religious reasons, there's a lot of tension between the two countries that still exists today. They're very competitive when it comes to cricket, and sometimes in the news you'll hear of gunfire at the Indian and Pakistani border. And then obviously the poem centres mainly around the partition of India itself, dividing a country into two and forcing people to flee from one part of the country to the other based on their, again, political beliefs, religious beliefs, etc. To give a bit more detail about that, throughout India's history there's been many religions such as Hinduism, Islam, Sikhism, Jainism, and so on and so forth. When India and Pakistan divided into two countries, in Pakistan it was a Muslim country, so a lot of Muslim Indians went to the northwest to go into Pakistan, and if there were any, for example, Hindu Indians or Jain Indians or Sikh Indians living in the northwest, they migrated southeasterly into India where they wouldn't be persecuted. There's also emotional conflicts going on in this poem. There's plenty of guilt and regret from Bhart's mother for not helping out more, maybe helping out some of those immigrants crossing the border from India to Pakistan, or vice versa, from Pakistan to India. So Bharт employs a lot of techniques. There's actually so many I couldn't fit it on this table, so I've just put a few of them on here. Linguistically, the poem is written in the third person, so Bharт is narrating her mother's story. The first section of the poem's in the past tense, and the second section's in the present tense, so we have a time shift marked by the Volta and the flash forward. We have use of senses. Most poets engage the sense of sight, but Bharт has made a real effort to engage the sense of sound as well. Some phrases and words get repeated. Stood gets repeated, listening gets repeated, and cries of the people gets repeated for effect. There's a powerful rhetorical question at the end, and there's a personification of the tree, which I'll explain in a bit. Structurally, the poem is laid out in one long, irregular stanza with no rhythm and no rhyme. Now, I think this is significant. If a poem has rhythm or a meter, or some kind of rhyme and rhyme scheme, we would say that poem is controlled or tightly structured. By having an irregular poem with no rhythm or no rhyme, this poem is what you would consider a loose structure or a free structure. And I believe this symbolises India's freedom from the British Empire. And that's why the poem is written in such a loose structure. I also have another theory about the layout of the poem, but I'll come to that towards the end of the video. Structurally, we do have a flash forward, we have a shift in time. You could identify this poem as a piece of post-colonial poetry. We get dialogue at the end from Bhart's mother, which is usually is a structure you normally find in storytelling and narratives, but we get it in this poem as well. And we get indentations in that last section, which makes the poem visually look quite unusual on the page. And again, I'll explain what I think the effect of that is. Poetically speaking, there's enjambment. Enjambment helps identify some keywords. It also helps speed up the poem and add to a sense of chaos that the partition would have caused. There's caesura, which is punctuation in the middle of the lines. This usually, again, highlights keywords or images, but also creates a sense of uncertainty and a stop-start nature to the flow of the poem. We have that Volta at line 20, signified by the word now, that changes it from the past tense to the present tense. We also get some quite interesting tones. We get a bit of sarcasm towards the end, which I'll explain in a bit. We have a few things that contrast. We have contrasting settings, the safety of the garden and the danger of the railway station. They contrast, and then towards the end of the poem, the danger of the railway station contrasts with the safety of the kitchen. We get contrasting characters. We get Bart's grandmother, who is quite scared and passive. She can be contrasted with Bart's mother's auntie, who is very active and very brave in how she deals with the partition. So lots of contrast to explore, and as I mentioned before, I think this poem is narrative. It has all the ingredients of a narration. It has characters, setting, and a plot. So I will start by identifying all the techniques and then linking them to where you find the quote in the stanza. So first thing to notice, this poem is in third person. We know that because of the pronoun she. Second thing to notice, the poem starts off in the past tense, and we know that because of the past tense verb was. Now, I quite like the fact that Bart has been very specific with the time period. She said her mother was 19 years old. If you study history, your history teacher has probably told you about the importance of including statistics such as dates and times. It really brings history to life, and I think by letting the reader know that her mother was 19 years old, it shows just how young she was to have such a horrific and life-changing event happen. Now, if you're studying for your GCSEs, you're only a few years off being 19 yourself. Imagine if the country you lived in was split in two. 1 million people died, 14 to 18 million people were made homeless or had to flee, and you may have had to flee because of your religious or political beliefs as well. That would have had a life-changing effect on a 19-year-old. We get enjambment, so the first few lines run on into each other. She was 19 years old then, and when she stood in her garden, she could hear the cries of people stranded in the Ahmedabad railway station. So that's all one line, one image, one idea. But by making the idea run on across many lines, it speeds up the poem. It creates a sense of chaos that I'm sure you would have encountered at the Ahmedabad railway station as people tried to flee across the border, depending on which direction they were heading. I think it also highlights some key words. So after cries of the people, we get the word stranded, and instead of putting it at the end of the previous line, by putting it at the start of that fourth line, it really highlights the effect of the partition. People were left stranded and quite vulnerable. We have repetition, so 3 key words and phrases get repeated. The word stood gets repeated twice, and that shows how passive Bart's grandmother was. Now, personally, I don't blame her. She's 19 years old, and her entire country is being ripped into two. I think I myself would be sort of stunned into passivity. We also learn how passive Bart's mother is of the repetition of listening. So she doesn't actively get involved in helping people, she listens and experiences the terror, the chaos, the loss that is going on around her. We also have this phrase, cries of the people, repeated. Crying here is obviously a release of a negative emotion, perhaps sadness, anger, and the fact that it's people, not persons. And, India is one of the largest populations on Earth. If you can imagine millions of people crying, what an incredible noise that is. And I want to focus in on noise because Bart uses that a lot in her poetry. So you've got cries of the people, you've got the line, their noise, the line, a new sound added to the city. Bart here isn't just using the sense of sight, which pretty much all poets use. She's trying to use the sense of sound as well and create what you might call a soundscape, or you might call aural imagery, A-U-R-A-L, so noise imagery. And it sort of brings the poem to life. If you ever get the chance to go to India, I think it's a country of sensory overload. There's lots of people, lots of colours, lots of smell, and of course lots of noise that Bart is trying to bring across to the reader with all of this sound-based imagery. We can then look at the contrasting settings. So Bart's mother is stood in her garden. Now, gardens are usually quite safe places. There's trees, there's animals, it's peaceful, it's an escape from the real world. Contrast that with Ahmedabad's railway station, which is the real world, full of noise, full of refugees, full of people migrating, full of chaos, full of danger. I really don't blame Bart's mother. I mean, being safe in the garden sounds like a much better option. But as a result, I respect Bart's mother's auntie, who was risking her own life and her own resources to try and help other people. We get this hyperbole to exaggerate just how much of a negative effect the partition had. Bart's mother felt that the noise being produced was endless. It would never ever end. That was how much suffering India and the Indian people were going through during the partition. We get caesura, so we get the dashes, particularly the one after endless. That really helps exaggerate the hyperbole. It draws our attention to it. She felt it was endless. It being the partition. This partition would never end. The suffering would go on forever and ever. We also get a comma after aunt, which draws our attention to the aunt, and she's important because she acts as a contrasting character to Bart's mother. And we learn about their contrasting characteristics through the use of verbs. So Bart's mother stood in the garden. That's quite passive. She could hear people crying, but she didn't go and help them. That's quite passive. She felt the pain of India and the noise, but she didn't do anything to try and change it. Now contrast that with the verbs used to describe her aunt. Her aunt would go to the station with food and water. That's quite active. So where Bart's mother was passive, and she later regrets that, not helping people in the moment, Bart's mother's aunt was very active. So these are contrasting characters. She would go and help people and improve the situation. I want to draw your attention to end stopping. So we get end stopping after railway station and city with the full stops. End stopping really helps us to identify where the enjambment is. So when there is an end stop, we know that that is a complete unit of thought or an idea. So where we get lines where we don't see end stops, such as after then, garden and people in the first three lines, we can identify that enjambment is happening. Lines are running over one into the other. And then it's our job to try and work out the effect of that. I think it's to create a sense of chaos, maybe to emphasise that word stranded and how vulnerable the Indian people felt during the partition. I just want to point out it's one irregular stanza and there is no rhyme throughout. And that continues on into this section as well. No rhyme, irregular, no rhythm, no real structure. A sense of freedom, or India moving towards its freedom. So in this second section, we also have enjambment. We have an idea that runs over many lines. The first three lines into the fourth line is a contained idea. Again, it creates a sense of chaos, but it also emphasises the word listening. It would make sense for the poet to put, so she stood in the garden listening, all in one line, but by separating the word listening and dropping it down to the fourth line, it really makes the word listening stand out. And we know that listening is one of those words that is repeated, and it really emphasises Bart's mother's passivity. She was so shocked by the partition of India, all she could do was just stand and listen. Again, in the third line, we get the repetition of the word stood. Again, very passive. She could have been active, she could have helped, but she stood, she listened. She was probably in shock at what was going on, and really I don't blame her. I would probably be as well. So we've looked at the enjambment and the repetition. The setting, again, we return to the garden and how peaceful it is compared and contrasted against the chaos of the railway station. Bart further develops the soundscape, the oral imagery used in this poem. Even the birds sounded different, which I find interesting. So when India was peaceful, maybe pre-Empire times, the birds sang a happy song, but maybe when the British colonised India, the birds' song changed. It became more of a oppressed song, maybe. And now when the partition is happening and there is chaos and people are dying and people are being made homeless, the birds again have changed their song, maybe to something a bit more chaotic and discordant to reflect what is going on in the country. We also get the personification of a neem tree. The shadows cast by the neem trees brought no consolation. So India, if you ever get the chance to go, is a very hot country, so trees would have been very important for providing shade and shadows to give people relief from the heat. But even sitting in the shadow of a neem tree could not make Bart's mother feel any better. It couldn't bring any consolation, any feelings of peace or rest. Now, of course, a tree and a shadow cannot bring you something. They cannot physically bring you a gift. But humans can physically bring something. So this is an example of personification. The neem tree, and in particular its shadow, is being personified. But yet it can bring no help to Bart. You might not be familiar with neem trees. I don't think they grow natively in England, but a neem tree grows on the Indian subcontinent. And it's used for healing. It's got lots of medicinal properties. It's anti-inflammatory, antioxidants. It does many things. It can help with many treatments. So a neem tree can actually help people, and it's designed to help people. And Indians know how to use its leaves and bark, etc., to help people. However, this neem tree can't bring any help. Even Mother Nature, even the trees of India, can't help the people from the partition and the effects of the partition on the Indian people. Okay, so we get some caesura. Caesura is punctuation in the middle of the line. After listening, there's a full stop. It really draws our attention to the fact that Bart's mother was quite passive in this situation. We get contrasting characters again, so we get the repeated passive verbs. Bart's grandmother felt afraid. She stood. She listened. This isn't really active. She wished she could be more useful, but this is all passive. But then when we look at Bart's mother's aunt, and again we get the repetition of the verb go. The mother's aunt is active in the way she helps people. This creates contrast, and this creates a sense of regret in Bart's mother that we discover later on in the poem. Again, the end stopping is really there to emphasise where the enchantment happens. So there's an end stop after consolation and after people to help us identify where one idea or one image has been contained and comes to an end. Again, we get enchantment with "and each day passed with her listening to the cries of the people." It would make sense if all of that was one line, but by dividing the line after her, that makes the word listening stand out because it's the start of the new line. And we know that the word listening is repeated to emphasise how passive Bart's mother was during the partition of India. Speaking of repetition, we also get repeated the cries of the people, this sense of sound. Millions of Indian people and Pakistani people crying because of those who are dead, those who are displaced, because of their lives being cast into turmoil because of the British Empire. So we're in the third section now. Remember, there are no different stanzas. It is just one stanza, which is irregular and has no rhyme. But here at line 20, we get a volta, a change in tone. We were in the past tense, we're now in the present tense. And we can call this a flash forward. It's a flash forward of 50 or 51 years, because we know from the statistics, Bart's mother was 19 when the partition of India happened, but now she's 70 when she's reflecting on it. We know we're in the third person because of the pronoun she, and we know we're in the present tense because of the present tense form of the word is, the verb is. We get introduced to a new setting in this section, the kitchen. Now, in Asian culture, and in particular Indian culture, the kitchen is sort of like the heart of the household. It's where all the food is made and served, and food is being a very important part of Indian culture. So what's happened here is we've returned to a very safe space. So Bart's mother started off in a safe space in the garden. She was then exposed to the dangerous space, the Ahmedabad railway station. But but towards the end of the poem she returns to a safe space, and in this relative safety of her kitchen she's able to explore her feelings about what happened during the partition of India. I quite like this next bit. She is 70 years old, she here being Bart's mother, and India is 50 years old. And this is very sarcastic, because actually India's got a rich, long history. We're talking thousands of years of recorded history. But India is 50 years old in the modern sense, because it's only 50 years old since Britain gave it back its independence in 1947. So I definitely think there's a certain irony here. Bart is basically saying to her mother, "Look, Mum, you're older than the entire subcontinent of India. Ha ha ha." So there's a sarcasm, because Britain and the British Empire has sort of wiped out a lot of India's pre-colonial history by sort of giving it a new birth date when it gained its independence in 1947. But Bart's mother responds to that using dialogue. Now, dialogue is a technique we often find in story writing. It's fairly unusual in poems, so this is another piece of evidence of why I think this is a narrative style poem. And the dialogue's really important because it gives us direct insight into Bart's mother's thoughts and feelings. This poem is all about Bart's mother's life, and finally at the end we get to see how she feels about the partition of India. And she says, "But of course India is older than that." She acknowledges that India predates the 50 years. India wasn't born in 1947 when Britain gave it back to the Indians. India has been existed long before that. Its history is thousands of years old. And I think there's a sense of comfort in that India isn't just remembered for being a British colony, that it has its own history, its own culture, its own past. India was always there. I think that's a comforting thought for Bart's mother. We get some caesura in this section as well. So after 50 there's a full stop, after but there's a comma, after kitchen there's a dash. A lot of this sort of slows the poem down, creates maybe a disjointed feel. Perhaps Bart's mother, when she recounts her experience of the partition, finds it uncomfortable, and the thoughts and words don't flow from her mouth smoothly. They come out a bit disjointed because she's battling lots of internal emotional conflict, such as regret and guilt, and that is expressed in the caesura. It slows the poem down, it makes it a bit more disjointed when you read it. And this is the final section that looks really strange. And the reason it looks really strange is because Bart has used indents, to make certain lines stick out. So but and gone, they've been indented forwards, so has guilty, have and about. And it really changes the shape of the poem. Now, I have my own personal idea about this, and you may think it's crazy and you may want to ignore it, and feel free to do so. But I think the first section of the poem, let's say from lines 1 to line 26, I think that represents India being fairly stable. Perhaps being stable in their really long history before Britain came. And then after lines 26, lines 27 to the end of the poem, lines 32, the poem no longer looks stable. There's indentations, there's chaos, there's mess. Maybe that's representative of what the British Empire did to India. Maybe another way of looking at it is lines 1 to 26 represents what India was like under British rule during the British Empire. Britain brought over their sort of law and order and their organisation, and India was very stable under British rule. I know that some Indians were quite happy about the fact that Britain was ruling over them. But then when the partition happened in 1947, things got a bit disjointed, things got a bit messy, things stuck out, they were uncomfortable. A bit like the final section of this poem, from lines 27 to the end. It doesn't look right, things are disjointed, things are chaotic. I think the shape of the poem may give a suggestion about the history of India or the effects of the partition on India. That's just my interpretation. And we do again get enjambment, and this enjambment in this final section is sort of a running on of ideas. All of this section is dialogue. It's Bart's mother speaking, and as she gets her ideas out, sometimes there's enjambment and the ideas run over each other, and it creates a sense of speed, as if she wants to get this burden off her chest. At other times, because of the indentations and the way it's laid out in separate lines, it can feel a bit disjointed, as if she is battling some conflicting emotions inside of her as she recalls what happened during the partition. We end off with a really, really powerful question. How could they have let a man who knew nothing about geography divide a country? Now, I have consulted my history books and the internet, and I'm trying to work out who that man was. I think it could be a couple of people. It could be Lord Mountbatten. Now, Lord Mountbatten was the last Viceroy of India. Viceroy is a title you give to someone who occupies land on behalf of a king or queen. So Lord Mountbatten was in charge of India and occupied India on behalf of the British Empire, and King George VI was on the throne at the time. Now, his job was to go and give India back its independence, and in doing so set up this partition of India. Now, he didn't really invest the necessary time and effort to do a proper job. He was more bothered about getting back to England and furthering his naval career, his career in the Navy. So he didn't do a great job at giving India back its independence. He sort of said, here you go, and left, and that left India in a state of chaos. So maybe this is the man that Bart's mother is blaming for the effects of the partition of India. According to my history books, I reckon another guilty candidate could be Sir Cyril Radcliffe. He was a viscount. A viscount is a rank in the British hierarchy. And Sir Cyril Radcliffe's job was to divide India and Pakistan into two separate countries. His job was to find the border and draw the border on the map, and then the soldiers would go and enforce that border crossing. And again, Sir Cyril Radcliffe didn't do a great job. He spent a few days looking at a map. He drew a line and he said, here, this is the Indian bit, this is the Pakistani bit. And it happened so suddenly that people didn't really have time to prepare to move. It was just one day there was no border, next day there was a border, and if you were, say, a Hindu Indian in the Muslim section, suddenly all the Muslims would hate you and drive you out of that part of India. Or say you were, which is now Pakistan, or say you were a Muslim Indian in the Indian section, all the Hindus and the Sikhs and the Jains may not want you there anymore, and they may violently drive you up into Pakistan so you could go be with your fellow Muslims. So the fact that Sir Radcliffe drew a very, not botched, but very not well thought out border, and it happened so suddenly, and it forced people to be displaced and to immigrate quickly, he could be the man that Bart's mother is blaming for this divided country and the 1 million deaths and the 14 to 18 million people displaced. Could the man also be the person in charge of Britain at the time, and therefore in charge of the British Empire, King George VI? Ultimately, it would have been his call to give India back its independence, so he would have set in motion this partition of India. He could be to blame even more because he actually let his cousin, Lord Mountbatten, deal with the process of giving India back its independence. Maybe he didn't choose the best man for the job, maybe he just chose his cousin to keep it within the family. So maybe King George is to blame for not handling the relinquishing of power and removing the British Empire from India smoothly. Maybe he's the guy to blame. Maybe it's not a physical man at all, maybe it's a metaphorical man. Maybe Bart's mother blames Britain, Great Britain, who came along to India, colonised it, put our sort of stamp or cultural way of doing things on India, and then when it suited us, we just left, and we left India in a state of chaos with a partition, a divided country, and political, religious, and physical wars to battle out, and we just evacuated. Maybe the man is metaphorical Britain. I really don't know. It's not necessarily important for you to make your own decision. I just wanted to present some of the history and some of the ideas that Bhatt might be trying to get across in her poem. So, you can make notes from this video on a physical copy of Partition by Bhatt. You can also try answering the exam-style question, how does Bhatt explore the effects of conflict over time in Partition? If I was you, I'd look at lines 1 to 19, where we're in the past tense, and she explores how conflict can make some people act and help people, whereas it freezes some people in fear. You may want to look at how over time, even though it's 50 to 51 years later, from lines 20 to the end of the poem, Bhatt's mother is still affected emotionally, no longer physically, but emotionally, by the effects of the partition of India. And you've got plenty of linguistic, structural and poetic techniques you can use to support your answer. Well, if you found this video useful, please give it a like and consider subscribing to my channel so you can get all of the OCR conflict poetry analysis videos, and feel free to leave a comment if you think I missed out anything that you would like to share. Thank you for your attention, and I'll see you on the next one.